Compare that to the stock market's roughly 10% historical average, and on paper, real estate just crushed it. Doubled it, even. This is the number that gets repeated at every family dinner and every real estate seminar. It's also only half true. Here's the uncomfortable part. Leverage is not a one-way multiplier. It cuts both directions with equal force. If that same house drops 4% in a bad year instead of rising, you don't lose 4% of your investment. You lose 20% of it, because the loss is measured against your $56,000 down payment too, not the full home value. A market that dips 10%, which has happened repeatedly in real estate cycles, can wipe out an entire down payment on a leveraged property. Almost nobody runs the math in that direction before they buy, because nobody wants to. Marcus bought his first rental property at 26. He was proud, and he had every right to be excited. He technically beaten the market in year one using this exact math, and he told everyone who would listen. What he didn't mention, because he genuinely hadn't thought about it yet, was that he was leveraged 4-to-1 on an asset that can also fall, in a way his brokerage account never could. Leverage is the loudest number in the room. It's just not the only one, and it's definitely not the safest one. 2. Real estate has a silent bleed that quietly erases most of that appreciation. Here's the part that almost never makes it into the "my house doubled in value" story. A house is not a static asset sitting in a vault. It's a physical object that decays, and decay costs money every single year, whether you notice it or not. Homeownership costs roughly 1% to 4% of a home's value annually in maintenance alone. A new roof, HVAC repairs, water heater replacement, the dozens of smaller things that break in any house over a decade. On top of that, there's property tax, which averages about 1.1% of home value nationally according to the Tax Foundation, though it runs considerably higher in states like New Jersey and Illinois. Add homeowners insurance, which has climbed sharply in the last several years due to rising construction costs and climate-related claims. If it's a rental property, add vacancy periods where you're paying the mortgage with no tenant covering it. Stack all of that together on a $280,000 house and you're looking at a conservative $8,000 to $11,000 a year in ongoing costs. Money that has to come out of that 4% appreciation before you ever see a dollar of real, bankable profit. In a lot of years, the silent bleed doesn't just reduce the gain. It erases it entirely. Elena inherited her late mother's house and decided to rent it out rather than sell. For 6 years, she watched the estimated value tick up every quarter on her phone, feeling wealthier with every notification. It wasn't until she finally sold the property that she sat down and actually totaled the 6 years of costs. A new roof after a storm, 2 stretches of vacancy between tenants, a decade's worth of accumulated property tax, and realized it had quietly eaten nearly half of what looked, on paper, like a clean, easy gain. Sit with that for a second. Half the gain was never actually a gain. It was an illusion created by only looking at one number, the sale price, and ignoring every number that came before it. So what happens when you take that same $56,000 and put it somewhere with almost none of that bleed? 3. Stock market returns come with almost no ongoing bleed, and that's the real trade-off. The S&P 500 has averaged roughly 10% annually before inflation, or about 7% after inflation, over the last century, according to long-run data compiled by NYU Stern School of Business. That number already accounts for the Great Depression, multiple recessions, 2 major crashes in the 2000s, and a global pandemic. It's not a cherry-picked bull market number. It's the average across essentially all of it. And here's the part that matters for this comparison specifically. There is no roof to replace. No tenant to chase down for late rent. No insurance premium climbing every renewal. A basic total market index fund often carries an expense ratio under 0.1% a year, a fraction of a percent, compared to the 1% to 4% a house quietly bleeds annually just standing still. Curtis put his $56,000 into a total market index fund the exact same year Marcus bought his rental property. Curtis has never fixed a leaking pipe, never screened a tenant, never gotten a call about a broken furnace at midnight. He also, and this matters, has never once been able to live inside his investment, or point to something physical and say, "That's mine." And that's the real trade-off underneath all of this. Because stocks give you almost nothing back except the number on the screen going up. No shelter, no equity you can walk into, nothing to renovate or personalize. Just growth, quietly compounding, with almost no maintenance required. So which one is actually better? It depends on a factor most comparisons skip entirely: how fast you might need that money back. 4. Real estate has a liquidity wall, stocks don't. Liquidity is a word that sounds abstract until the moment you actually need cash fast, and then it becomes the only number that matters. Selling a house typically takes 30 to 90 days from listing to closing, even in a strong market, and that's before accounting for repairs a buyer might request, or a sale falling through entirely. On top of the time, you'll typically pay 5% to 6% in real estate agent commissions, according to data from the National Association of Realtors, plus closing costs, title fees, and transfer taxes. On that same $280,000 house, that's $15,000 to $20,000 in costs just to convert the asset back into usable cash, money that disappears the moment you decide you need liquidity. Selling stock, by comparison, takes about 2 seconds during market hours and costs close to nothing in a standard modern brokerage account. No commission, number 60-day wait, no negotiating with a buyer over who pays for the water heater. Sana needed $30,000 quickly when her small business hit an unexpectedly rough quarter and a supplier demanded payment up front. Curtis, in a similar situation, sold shares that same afternoon and had the cash in his account within 2 business days. Marcus, faced with a comparable need, had to consider a home equity line of credit instead, new paperwork, a new interest rate, a new monthly payment, because his money was sitting inside physical walls he couldn't quickly convert back into cash. That is the real cost of an investment you can't easily touch. It's not visible on a home value estimate, and it never shows up in the "my house doubled" story, but it's very real the one time in your life you actually need the money fast. If this is already changing how you think about your own money and your own plan, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this kind of math coming, on topics most people never see broken down this clearly. 5. Real estate lets you live inside the investment, stocks never will. Here's a piece that raw return on investment numbers always miss, and it's important enough that skipping it makes any real estate versus stocks comparison fundamentally incomplete. If you're comparing buy a house to live in versus rent an apartment and invest the difference, you cannot just compare appreciation percentages. You have to add back the rent you would otherwise be paying every single month, because that's real money you're not spending, and it belongs on the ledger. In most U.S. metro areas, that's somewhere between $1,800 and $2,500 a month for a comparable living space. Money a renter investor is spending and never getting back, while a homeowner is redirecting that same amount into equity. That's value a stock portfolio can never hand you, no matter how well it performs. A brokerage statement doesn't put a roof over your head. Farah sat down and actually ran her own numbers before buying her first home, something most people skip entirely. She discovered that her projected mortgage payment, once she subtracted the rent she'd otherwise be paying for a comparable apartment in her city, was actually lower than what she was already paying to rent. No stock chart, no matter how impressive the 10-year average looked, could have shown her that specific, personal number. That single-line item, rent you're no longer paying, changes the entire equation for anyone buying a home to actually live in, rather than buying it purely as a financial instrument. But for real estate purchased purely as an investment property, without living in it, the math tilts back the other way, and that brings us to the part almost nobody accounts for honestly. 6. Rental income looks like free cash flow, until you count your own unpaid hours. On paper, a rental property might net $300 to $500 a month in cash flow after covering the mortgage, property tax, and insurance. That number gets posted proudly on finance forums and social media as proof that real estate produces passive income. The word passive is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and it usually doesn't hold up. That net cash flow figure almost never includes the landlord's own time, screening prospective tenants and running background checks, coordinating repairs with contractors, often multiple quotes deep to avoid getting overcharged, handling the 2 a.m. phone call about a burst pipe or a broken furnace in January. Even a modest 5 hours a month of this kind of work, valued conservatively at $30 an hour, less than most skilled trades charge, comes out to $150 a month in unpaid labor, quietly eating into that passive $300 to $500. Tom loved telling people his duplex paid for itself. Every time the topic came up at gatherings, he didn't mention the Saturday afternoon he spent underneath a bathroom sink with a plumbing snake instead of watching his daughter's soccer game, because that story doesn't fit as neatly into the passive income narrative he'd built for himself. Stocks don't call you at 2 a.m. They don't need a plumber. That's not a small, forgettable detail buried in the fine print. It's the entire definition of what passive is actually supposed to mean, and it's the piece the rental income headline number almost always leaves out. 7. The real answer isn't real estate versus stocks. It's what each one is actually for. Put all 6 of these pieces side by side and a clearer picture starts to form, one that doesn't fit neatly into either side's usual talking points. Real estate wins decisively on leverage, on forcing a kind of disciplined savings that's hard to undo on impulse, and on giving you an actual place to live that a portfolio never can. Stocks win decisively on liquidity, on requiring almost zero ongoing effort or maintenance, and on producing returns that don't get quietly eaten by a leaking roof or a vacant unit. The data doesn't crown a single winner. Case-Shiller's appreciation numbers on one side, NYU Stern's century of market returns on the other. What the data actually shows is 2 fundamentally different tools, built for 2 fundamentally different jobs, that only look like competitors because they're usually compared in the same breath. Nina, watching both Marcus and Curtis navigate their very different paths, didn't try to pick a winner between them. She bought a modest starter home specifically to stop paying rent and start building equity in a place she needed to live anyway, solving problem 1. Then she took every extra dollar beyond that and invested it into index funds instead of chasing a second investment property, solving problem 2, separately, with the tool actually built for it. That's the answer that doesn't fit into a 60-second clip or a confident, one-line hot take. It's also the one that actually holds up once you run every number instead of just the flattering ones. Wealth was never really about which single asset wins a head-to-head comparison. It's about seeing the full math on every dollar you put to work, including the parts that don't show up on a home value estimate, and the parts that don't show up on a stock ticker either. Back at that driveway, 10 years later, the 2 friends are still standing there, and the whole picture finally comes into focus. The homeowner has real equity, a home full of memories, and a silent bleed of costs they never once sat down and tracked. The investor has a larger number glowing on a screen, a liquidity wall that, as it turns out, never actually mattered much to their particular life, and no physical walls of their own to come home to every night. Neither friend lost. They simply never saw the whole board, until right now. If you want to see this exact kind of math applied to the biggest, highest stakes version of this decision, whether to rent or buy the actual home you live in day to day, not as an investment strategy but as a life decision, that's the video to watch next. If this reshaped even slightly how you're thinking about your own next financial move, go ahead and subscribe. This channel exists to break down the real math behind big money decisions, the parts most people only ever hear the confident, surface-level version of, repeated at family dinners and never actually checked. Here's a question for the comments, and I'd genuinely like to read your answer. Which side of this have you lived personally? The house that quietly cost more than it ever looked like on paper, or the portfolio that grew steadily but never quite felt like yours, the way a home does? And one honest note before you go. I read every comment on these videos, every single one. This isn't financial advice. It's the math I wish someone had sat down and shown me clearly before I made my own decision. Do your own research, run your own numbers with your own real figures, and make the call that actually fits your life.